Story 1. On Halloween night a couple years ago, something happened. I had planned to trick-or-treat throughout the neighborhood with one of my friends, just like most kids my age would. At the time, we were both 12 years old, which meant that while it wouldn't have seemed odd to continue trick-or-treating, we were also old enough to go without our parents. I recall being quite thrilled only for this reason. We would be able to take our own route to all the wonderful houses since it would be the first time we could go trick-or-treating by ourselves. The evening was proceeding as any other Halloween night would. When it grew dark out, we had our bags about halfway full. By that time, I believe it was around 9 o'clock, when people began turning off the lights in their homes to indicate they would no longer be answering the door. My friend advised that we start going home, but I was obstinate and wanted to see every house we could. Ultimately, we decided to visit one more cul-de-sac before returning home. We now live in a nice neighborhood, but for some reason there were very few street lights, and many of the houses had their lights turned off, making it increasingly difficult to see. As we continued walking, seemingly out of nowhere, we both noticed the silhouette of a man walking towards us, not like other trick-or-treaters, but rather some lone full-grown man. As we got closer, we realized he was a police officer, and as we walked past him, he introduced himself. During the brief talk, he continued by saying that someone had reported the incident to the police, and that is why he had been to the scene in the first place. He kept saying, "My police car is just over there," as if he had truly spoken it while pointing in some unspecified location. Even at the age of 12, the entire encounter felt incredibly out of the ordinary, but what the officer said next completely caught both of us off guard. He said he needed to talk to the man, but that since he was a police officer, the man wouldn't open the door for him, even though he said if we knocked on the door, the man would probably open it. After the man tried to lure us inside, the officer said he would leap out of the bushes and catch the man. To put this into perspective, you must realize how absurd this request was. A supposed law enforcement officer asked two 12-year-old children to purposefully approach the home of a man who was allegedly luring children inside while we stood there speechless with each other. I wanted to speak up and say no, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it as soon as a large group of teenagers came around to bend in the street. He was essentially asking children he had just met to act as bait. Neither of us responded for a while. Eventually, the officer broke the silence by saying something along the lines of how we needed to do this quickly. By this point, we hadn't even agreed. They were moving towards us. When the group of teenagers passed us, one of them asked us if we knew that guy. We replied that we didn't, and we briefly explained what had just happened. The group agreed that the situation was odd and offered to walk us back home. At that point, the officer said he would be right back and not to go anywhere. My friend and I accepted the offer, and after that we pretty much kept our experiences to ourselves. However, as time has gone on, I've begun to regret not raising the issue and going to the police. We aren't sure if the person was actually a police officer, but the older I get, the more I think they weren't, and even if they were, putting two 12-year-olds in such a potentially dangerous situation is not appropriate for a law enforcement official. I have no idea what the man's genuine motivations were, and that idea still bothers me. Story 2. On October 31, 2016, it was Halloween. I was 23 years old at the time and had a 2-story home of my own. Halloween in 2016 was very unlike anything I had ever experienced before. There were a few months back then when all anyone could talk about were these killer clown signings and other events of that sort, and of course that year Halloween fell during the height of the killer clown craze. I recall a lot of parents not letting their children go trick-or-treating that year because of it. I myself didn't really have anything planned. I was just going to hang out with a few friends while handing out candy to the kids that came by. But that was pretty much it. Eventually, for the end of the night when the doorbell ring started to slow down, the three of us, me and my 2 friends, who we'll call Thomas and Kenny for the sake of this story, started talking. At one point, Thomas mentioned a haunted house nearby. He suggested that we visit to see how scary it was. However, Thomas insisted that the establishment was the real deal. I assumed that by this point that I was too old for such things, but Thomas insisted that it was the real deal. or at least that's what he said. We all decided to check it out because it was only a 5-minute walk away. I didn't say it aloud, but when we arrived, it didn't look as scary as Thomas had made it out to be. In fact, it appeared as though some teenagers had set it up in a matter of hours. We went inside and I soon realized that the place wasn't particularly scary. I got jump scared a couple of times, but that was about the extent of the fear. I must admit that the costumes were excellent. You could tell that a lot of time had gone into making them. What was odd, though, was that after they frightened us, they followed us through the house. All of the other costumed characters would frighten us once and wait for the next people to walk through. But these guys literally followed us until we returned to the outside. This made me uneasy, but I kept quiet. We all made our way back to my house, and about 30 minutes or so after Thompson and Kenny left, my doorbell rang. It was common for late-night trick-or-treaters to do so, but since it was already after midnight, there was no way this was a child looking for candy. I chose to ignore the noise, only to hear footsteps in my backyard a minute later. I flickered my back porch line on and off several times to scare the teens away, but by this point, I was only annoyed in my mind. I looked out the window to see if it had any effect, and that's when I saw 3 men dressed as clowns running into the shadows. My thoughts immediately turned to the haunted house earlier that evening, but how could they know where I lived unless they followed me there? I texted a group chat with Thomas and Kenny after going upstairs and stating, "Guys, I think those 3 clowns from the haunted house were just in my backyard." Kenny would reply, "Dude, call the cops." I reasoned it wasn't a horrible idea. At the very least, the police would show there and I could file a trespassing report. However, as I dialed 911, the terrifying sound of one of the downstairs windows shattering filled my ears. By this time, my phone had not stopped ringing, so I closed my bedroom door and ran into the wardrobe. A few moments later, I swear I hear your footsteps slowly making their way upstairs. I tried to remain silent as best I could, but for the life of me I couldn't keep my breathing down, and this went on for what felt like an eternity. When an operator answered, I whispered that some men in clown costumes had just broken into my house not even a minute ago. I was told to lock myself in a room and hide while staying in the queue. After the cops made their presence in the house known, I would meet them downstairs when the relieving sound of police sirens could be heard outside in the street, followed by hasty footsteps downstairs and out the back door. It was left with a broken kitchen window, but surprisingly, nothing was stolen. Though I don't necessarily see this as a good thing, as it proves they weren't there to rob the place. Instead, they probably had much worse intentions. I explained how I heard the intruders leave through the back door and they would call for backup. Those 3 clowns would not be found that night, and because they were wearing masks the entire time, there is a good chance they'll never be identified. I'm still unsure of why they chose to target me particularly. Story 3. I was 14 years old when this happened. On Halloween, I had plans with a friend to go trick-or-treating that evening. Now that I think about it, I recognize that 14 is a little old to still be trick-or-treating, but my friend and I believed we had one more year because we lived in a pretty good community. It took around 3 minutes to go between each door because there is roughly an acre of front yard for each house, but this was more than offset by the generous supply of full-sized candy bars that were provided. Anyway, my friend and I have been trick-or-treating for about an hour. The neighborhood basically got its reputation as one filled with a ton of rich older people who would all give out full-size candy bars because of this. It wasn't unusual for a lot of other people to come from nearby neighborhoods to trick-or-treat. The house was far older than most of the other homes in the neighborhood when we came across it, but we could tell since it had lights on inside and even a few modest Halloween decorations set up outside. It also had an old white van parked in the driveway. So when we arrived at the front door, we rang the doorbell. A short while later, a middle-aged man wearing a Scream costume opened the door. At first, my friend and I were both excited because usually if the house owner was dedicated enough to dress up in costume, the people inside would be handing out candy. We knew we were about to receive some more teasing chocolates. I don't even remember what candy was given to us after we both said trick or treat, but I do remember what happened next. We both said thank you and started to leave when the man motioned for us to wait. He said he had more candy for us, but that we would have to wait inside while he went to get it. The man with the camera then appeared around the corner and explained how he always liked to take pictures of the kids every Halloween because he loved seeing their different costumes. It was odd, but we were 14 and figured free candy was free candy. When we entered, we were greeted with a full wall of Polaroid pictures of various children dressed in Halloween costumes. I turned to face my friend, as we both turned to face the man. I advised that since our mothers were waiting for us in the car, we should leave right now. Even if that wasn't true, I didn't feel at ease there. It was genuinely very eerie. We tried to forget the whole situation as we continued trick-or-treating 30 minutes later, and we'd practically forgotten all about it. But that's when we noticed a lone white van parked on the street in front of us. This instantly made me feel better. Then, as we were walking down the driveway, I glanced back at the front door. The man was just standing there, still looking at us, completely motionless. We both slowed down a little as we realized there was a remote possibility that it was the same van. Even so, as we approached it, it shifted from park to drive and began to sag behind us. We tried to remain calm, reasoning that it was probably just some parents transporting their children from house to house, which was more common than you might imagine given that the houses were a good 3 minutes walk apart. We saw the van parked someplace behind us when we arrived at the next house. After some time passed, we realized no children were exiting the van. What do we do, dude? It had to be the same person from earlier. I replied that we should sprint as we were only 10 minutes from my house at this time. As soon as we made the reservation, my friend and the vehicle both agreed. We were certain that this man was following us at this point. When I turned to look behind us, the vehicle was right there. We both saw that there was no prospect of us outrunning this beast if we stayed next to the road, so we hopped a fence and went through a field until we reached the rear of my house, where we ran inside and locked all the doors. The man was gone. I still reflect about this interaction every now and again. It would be the last time I ever went through trigger training, because this was by far the most distressing thing I had ever encountered. Outro. In the chilling depths of darkness, where fear and terror converge, we've embarked on this spine-tingling journey through the macabre, as we bid farewell to the horrors that haunt the shadows. Remember, the next time you tune in, a new nightmare awaits. Stay vigilant, my friends.